Good morning, everyone. It's time for us to start. We're running a little bit behind by 17 minutes or so. And without further delay, we're going to start. My name is Wendy Comiotis, and I'm the Executive Director of METRAC. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Some people are here for the first time. Some of you are returning from last year's first conference. And some of you are returning from last night's very powerful presentation by Mr. Tim Wise, our guest or distinguished guest speaker for today. So I'd like to first acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississauga First Nation. And yeah, it's important to know the roots on which we stand. The other piece that I'd like to start by acknowledging is that we're a relatively small group gathered, as you can see, and we've had a number of registrants who from the east of the country, Nova Scotia and so on, where obviously we've had our share of unrelenting snowy weather this year, and they're continuing to have it, and we might have our share later today. But anyways, the result is that we've had a few cancellations, and we've also had other cancellations in relation to the time of year and people's busy schedules. So what that means is that there's more time for you to ask all those questions that you've always wanted to ask. So here's the opportunity. It's time to, and also provides an opportunity for you to connect with people and really maximize your learning and get a lot of individual benefit from today. So that's the good side. So here we are, it's our second annual From Counting People to Making People Count conference, and it's co-hosted by my organization, METRAC, and Turner Consulting Group. So it's a partnership. METRAC is an organization that prevents violence against women and youth. Our mission and our dedication is to advancing equity, safety, and justice for women and youth impacted by violence. And we're really proud, well, sort of a bittersweet situation because our goal is really not to exist. It's to end violence, and once that's done, we can pack up and our work is done. Unfortunately, because it is a pervasive and persistent problem, this is our 30th anniversary year. So we're continuing to do the work, and we hope that we're continuing to do that work in the best way that we can. Turner Consulting Group is an equity, diversity, and inclusion consultancy firm that helps clients create a diverse workforce and inclusive workplace. So for today, we are hoping that Making People Count will be an intimate, boutique-style conference, an opportunity to learn from experts and get trained in equity and inclusion. Organizations and workplaces are challenged these days to comply with legislation and respond to changing dynamics and demographics. It's not about ticking the check boxes anymore. We have to make people count and build excellent inclusion practices, policies, and organizational cultures. Making People Count 2014 is designed to show you just how to do that. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Tim Wise. We're honored to have Mr. Wise, prominent anti-racist essayist and educator with us. He was here with us last night at the pre-conference presentation, and we're honored to have him back again today. Mr. Wise began his career as a youth coordinator and associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. From there, he became a community organizer in New Orleans, public housing, and a policy analyst for a children's advocacy group focused on combating poverty and economic inequity. He served as an adjunct professor at the Smith College School of Social Work, and from 1999 to 2003, he was an advisor to the Fisk University Race Relations Institute. Mr. Wise is the author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, and Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority and Colorblind. And Colorblind, the Rise of Post-Racial Politics and the Retreat from Racial Equity. Mr. Wise has been featured in several documentaries and appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues. He's graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. This is a group located in New Orleans. He and his wife, Christy, are the proud parents of 2 daughters, and he is a scholar and philosopher Cornel West calls Tim Wise a vanilla brother in the tradition of abolitionist John Brown. So on that note, I am going to hand over the mic to Mr. Wise. Welcome to Toronto.
Thank you very much. I know it is early. I appreciate you all being here. It is actually a bit earlier even for me. I think my wife just dropped our kids off at school probably about 30 minutes ago. So normally at this time of the morning, I'm probably 2 cups of coffee in and wiping the sleep out of my eyes, hardly thinking about the issues that I'm going to speak to you about today, but I got up sort of early so I could get started, so I began to think about what I wanted to say to you and what I wanted to share, particularly for those of you who were here last night, not so as to be redundant. There are a lot of things I would like to say again, or to at least in some sense similar, but some things I also want to say differently. One of the things that I came on that I thought would be a good thing to say, that I came upon as I was thinking, was that it's odd to me to be in an event that's sort of billed as a diversity event. And the reason it's odd is because in some sense, and if you're familiar with my work, you know, that I really don't believe in this concept of diversity. Now, I don't mean by that I'm opposed to it. I mean, that would be absurd, and no one would invite me to come to an event like this if I were. But what I mean by that is I don't believe in it in the sense that that is the kind of conversation that we need to be having when we talk about workforce equity or we talk about educational equity or any form of institutional equity. I believe in diversity, but I believe in it like I believe in air, Air simply is. I can take it for granted because it's a real thing. I guess if it, were suddenly to escape the room, I would feel quite a bit differently about it. I would believe in it as a much more important necessity that I wish we had. But in the sense that we have air, we're surrounded by it, to believe in air doesn't really mean very much. Doesn't say much about who I am at my core and what I'm actually about. And the same is true with diversity, right? Diversity is sort of just it's a reality. It's a thing without which the human species wouldn't have made it nearly this far. So in a sense, to say that one is for diversity is like saying that one is for air. It is an inevitability. It means very little about where our institutions are at present and where they're going to be 5 years from now, 20 years from now. So I'm not much of an expert on the issue of diversity or much of an advocate for it, because I think so often it ends up being the thing that we talk about so as not to talk about the much more important stuff. It becomes a bit of a diversion. How can we be more diverse? Not necessarily how can we be more equitable. In other words, it's like saying, well, we have air, but the air isn't particularly clean. Right? We can have air that's pretty polluted. It still allows us to breathe, but it may not be that what we're breathing is particularly healthy or helpful. Right? We have to actually think about how to clean the air, how to make the air something that is truly sustaining for us, just as we need to be willing to make diversity, which is an inevitability and a human reality, into something that actually works for the benefit of all people. And I learned something about the difference in these two concepts over the last 20 to 25 years that I've been on the road speaking about issues of mostly racial equity, but also gender justice and class equity and equity on the basis of sexual orientation, disability, and other isms and other forms of identity. And among the things that I've learned is that for the most part, we've got to unlearn just about everything that we've been taught about those subjects, right? And when I say taught, I don't necessarily mean in the formal sense. I don't mean in the classroom sense. I mean sort of the passive and indirect way that we've been led to understand issues like racism and sexism and other forms of bias. Because for most of us, I think, it's fair to say that we were led to believe, sometimes directly, other times indirectly, that these were things that we could see, that they were obvious, that we knew when they were operating, and that we, of course, never practiced any of them. That we were not sexist, and we were not racist, and we were not heterosexist, and we were not, in any way discriminatory toward anyone. Now, there are those horrible people over there who do that. And there are those horrible people in the past in our countries, mine and yours. I'm, of course, from the United States, that did those things. But that we have progressed, that we have evolved as a species to the place where those things, if they do happen, they certainly don't happen in our institutions. They don't happen in our companies or our agencies or our nonprofit NGOs. They don't happen where we operate. And in a sense, what I've come to appreciate in that 20 to 25 years, based both on what the academic literature says, but also based on common observation and a certain degree of, I guess, what could be called common sense, is that for the most part, the bigger problems facing us when it comes to issues of equity, not so much diversity, because once again, we have an increasing level of that in our institutions, but equity, the things that block us from obtaining equity very rarely come in these obvious packages wrapped up with a nice bow where we can easily say, yes, that is racism and that is sexism, and we'll quarantine that over here and we'll get rid of it and then we'll have equity. It's rarely that simple. I would suggest that instead there are three very significant myths that we unfortunately too often believe and under which we are operating. And they get in the way of our ability as institutional actors to create real equity in our institutional spaces. Here are those myths in no particular order, but it's just the way that I wrote them out on the page. So first, I think we are operating under a myth of objectivity, and I mean this as a myth of personal objectivity. This goes back to the point that we like to see others as the problem, but we are objective, we are fair-minded, we are able, for instance, to evaluate job applicants in a fair-minded and objective way because we're good people and we want to get it right. And we're capable of evaluating applicants to a college or a medical school or a law school objectively and fairly because we're good people and we want to get things right. And we're able to evaluate our colleagues if we are in some type of managerial position over them and it's time for them to potentially get a promotion or at a faculty level to receive tenure because we're objective and we're good people trying to get it right. But virtually all the evidence, not some, not the evidence that I've chosen to cherry pick, but really all of it, tells us very clearly that objectivity on the personal level is a complete and utter myth, if not an entire fraud. And the quicker we learn that and come to terms with that, the quicker we'll be able to move toward generating real equity. Why do I say that objectivity is a fraud at the personal level? Well, the evidence on this, and you may be familiar with it, there's actually some material in the packet that goes into it very briefly and alludes to it. The evidence is increasingly telling us, mostly from the field of social psychology, that in fact, almost every single one of us walks around with a certain degree of internalized, unconscious, subconscious, or preconscious, or what is sometimes called implicit biases against others on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexuality, immigrant status, color, disability or ability status, body type, like all these kinds of different identities that we carry around and biases that we have been taught in a culture where we may have picked that stuff up from family, we may have picked it up from the media, we may have picked it up from teachers or whomever it might be. And as a result of our carrying that stuff around, it's always possible for those biases to emerge in certain moments. And the moment at which we're hiring people for jobs is one of those moments, according to the evidence. That moment when we're evaluating students in a classroom or for admission to a college is one of those moments. That moment that we're evaluating our colleagues when we have a managerial or supervisory capacity over them is one of those moments. It's that moment when it's very easy, according to the evidence, for us to have those buttons of stereotypes and those buttons of internalized biases pushed and not even know it's happening, because what the research says, for instance, is that when it comes to hiring, we're much quicker virtually all of us, to spot merit and ability more quickly in someone who reminds us of ourselves. Now, on one level, that's not really earth-shattering news, right? I mean, it makes sense. You tend to identify more readily with someone who reminds you of you. But the problem is, in a racially divided, culturally divided, economically divided society, too oftentimes who reminds us of us ends up taking on these very artificial sort of considerations. It's not just about who likes this kind of music versus who likes this kind of music, or, you know, what ball team do you root for, or what do you like to do in your spare time, or do you like long walks on the beach and puppy dogs, right? Those kinds of things, I suppose, are relatively neutral in terms of the impact they might have on a social order. But because of all the different divisions in our society, who reminds us of us too often is going to be someone who is gender similar, who is race similar, culture similar, religion similar. And so that's going to end up getting in the way of our ability, despite our best intentions, to be truly objective. The research on this, for instance, has found that about 75%, and I would say that that might be a lowball number based on some other research that is out there, but at least 75% of white folks, for instance, carry around certain subconscious and implicit biases against peoples of color, particularly African-descended folks, but also increasingly, the research says, with regard to Latino folks, with regard to indigenous or First Nations peoples, with regard to Asian Americans and Asian Canadians, and people really of color generally. And I would also suggest the research in a post-9/11 environment very clear about the increasing subconscious bias vis-a-vis our Muslim brothers and sisters, Arab folks, not necessarily Arab, but simply perceived as potentially Arab, or from that part of the world that we call, rightly or wrongly, the Middle East. That's a very interesting geographic term. We could talk about that some other time. But the point being that these internalized biases, according to the research, usually are held by people who are not consciously prejudiced in any way, right? They're people who, if you were to give them a lie detector test and ask them, are you racist? Are you sexist? Are you in any way prejudiced against this group or that group? They would say no, and they would pass. Because for the most part, they don't really believe or experience themselves holding these biases, yet the research says that they are there. One study I talked about last night, so those who were here, forgive me for repeating it, but I think it's worth mentioning. One study from a few years ago took white folks, for example, who were relatively liberal and open-minded, certainly carried no overt bias. They were pre-tested for that, actually, and they passed with flying colors. Took these white folks, hooked us up. I say us, I wasn't actually in the room, but I can speak for all white people. That's just that's the privilege of being a white man, I guess. Particularly a white man from the United States, because then that adds something to it, too. They took these white folks and they hooked us up to brain scan imaging machines, right? And the idea was that they're going to take these open-minded, not biased in an overt or conscious sense, white folks, hook us up to brain scan imaging machines, start flashing images on a computer screen that's been placed in front of us in this laboratory setting, right? And these images are going to be flashed so quickly, 85 milliseconds, so that they are too quick for the conscious mind to even know what it saw, right? These are subliminal images, the kind that movie theater operators used to insert in movies back in the 1950s. They would put the word popcorn on 2 of the frames in the film, right? So quick, you didn't even know you saw it, but now your subconscious mind knew you saw it, and by God, you were getting up and going to get popcorn. Half the theater getting out of their seats, 10 minutes into the film. They're all looking at each other going, really, we need some popcorn, right? Yeah, we got to have popcorn. You don't even know what's going on. You're being manipulated. It was a very effective tactic for marketing 50 and 60 years ago. It's just as effective now. So in this lab environment, they have these folks hooked up to brain imaging machines. They start flashing these images, most of them innocuous, meaningless images, no real reaction in the brain. Right? All of a sudden, they flash an image of a black male face on the screen, 85 milliseconds. The part of the brain that responds to fear, anxiety, and stress lights up like a Christmas tree in 90% of the participants in the study. Right? And as soon as that image is replaced with some other innocuous image like a tree or a puppy dog or a blade of grass or an ice cream cone or whatever it was, that response goes away, and there's, again, virtually no response at all to the other images, which is to say that that image was the only one that provoked that kind of response, and it did it in over 90% of the people in the study. And none of these people were bigots. None of these people were bad people, but all of them apparently had been conditioned at some level to respond with fear, anxiety, and stress to the mere presence of a black male face, and in this case, not on the street, not in the interview room on the job, not at the school, in the classroom, as I'm the teacher standing in front of a kid who I'm now having to evaluate and judge, but in a comfy, air-conditioned environment of a lab setting, there's still that reaction, that initial reaction of anxiety, of stress, of fear. If that can happen to relatively open-minded, non-bigoted white folks, What does that mean for the rest of us who may or may not be as open-minded and enlightened? We don't really know. It's happening subconsciously. And so unless we're aware of that, right, and we continue to believe the conceit that we're objective and that we're capable of evaluating people in an open and honest way, we're going to miss a lot of things, aren't we? We're going to miss the way that those subconscious biases may affect the way that we're actually judging people regardless of our best intention. There was a study that just came out at the end of 2013. You probably did not hear about it, but I think that it demonstrates conclusively what I'm talking about in the real world, out of the lab setting, what actually can happen. So this study was conducted by 4 economists at 3 different universities and a private research organization out of Illinois. And what these economists did, it was sort of a follow-up to a study from 10 years earlier. Now, you may have heard of the one 10 years ago. There was this study done by economists at MIT and the University of Chicago where they sent out resumes to about 1,500 different companies in locations all around the United States. I have 5,000 resumes, 1,500 firms, 5 or 6 large metropolitan areas. And what they did in that study, which you may have heard of, was they made sure that half the resumes had sort of stereotypically black names, quote unquote, and half of them had stereotypically white names, but the qualifications otherwise were equal, right? And what they discovered was that if you had a white name such that you would probably be perceived as being white, you had a 50% better chance of getting called back for an interview than someone with a quote-unquote black name, even if the qualifications were identical. They actually found that for someone who was perceived as black to have an equal chance of getting a call back, they actually had to have 8 extra years of work experience just to have the same odds of an interview, right? Now, there were some criticisms of this study that emerged after it was published. And I don't happen to think they were very strong, but they were out there. They said, well, it wasn't a very large study. It only involved a handful of metropolitan areas. It was only 5,000 resumes, or 1,500 resumes or whatever. And it was, very broad-based in terms of what kind of jobs, all these kinds of critiques. And they said, well, the names might have, been class cues as opposed to race cues, because someone might see the name and not necessarily think black, but they might think poor and black, and that's going to confound the data, whatever. Right? So there was a new study, and this new study actually tried to correct for all these things. It was 10,000 resumes. It was 15 to 20 different metropolitan areas, and they made sure the names were names that were identifiably, quote-unquote, white or black, but names that were also very common within the white community and the black community so as not to seem exotic or odd or strange or something that might cue something about economics or class status. And they also made sure to only send these resumes out to a handful of particular jobs in a particular set of industries where the qualifications are really clear as to what you would normally need. So they sent them out to accounting jobs, banking jobs, finance, right? A certain subset of jobs where, you can sort of narrow down what the qualifications are for those kind of things. These are not entry-level jobs generally, right? So they sent these out. And what they did, very ingenious, they made sure that when they sent them, that some of the white-sounding name resumes and some of the black-sounding name resumes had maximum qualifications. Some of them had sort of a mid-range, and some of them had very little. What they did in terms of jiggling those qualifications around was they looked at the qualifications as being 3 things fundamentally. One was, did you have a degree in the field? So if you're applying for an accounting job, do you have an accounting background educationally, right? That's obvious. The second was, had you ever done any kind of an internship in the particular field? The third thing was, did you have any work experience beyond the internship in that field? So these were the 3 things, and they made sure that some of the white folks and some of the black folks had all 3 of those. Some had none, some had 1 but not the other 2 but not the other 1, and they jiggled them and they sent them out. Now, it may not surprise you that for people that didn't have any of the qualifications, they had never worked in the field, they never done an internship in the field, and they had like an English literature degree, right, applying for a finance job, won't surprise you to learn that most of those folks, whether they were white or whether they were black, didn't get a call back, right? Because they were perceived as, mostly less qualified, unqualified, so they didn't fare too well, regardless of race. There was a slight advantage for the white folks, but not much in that category. What was interesting was as you moved up the ladder of qualifications, so now you're getting into the folks who clearly, objectively, have what it takes based on their background. The more qualified that the black folks were, the bigger the gap got between them and the white folks who had the same qualifications, right? So all of a sudden, when you talk about the black folks who had the degree in the field, the work experience in the field, and the internship in the field, right, who you would think should have the same odds as the folks who were white, who have the degree and have the background and have the internship. Just like the folks at the bottom who were the same had pretty similar odds, you'd think at the top, and it wasn't, right? In fact, at the top of qualifications, that was where the biggest spread of opportunity was. White folks, 60% more likely at that stage to be called back for an interview than the black folks who were maximally qualified and equally so with them. In fact, what was really disturbing about the study, they found that the folks who were black actually and had maximum qualifications didn't have any better chance of an interview than the white folks who had none. The white folks who didn't have the relevant degree, didn't have the relevant work experience, had never done an internship, had just as good a chance as the black folks who had all of those. Now, is that evidence of overt racism? Well, maybe in some cases. I mean, they sent 10,000 resumes to lots of different companies. I'm sure that some of the people who did the evaluating might have been overtly racist, but here's the really frightening fact. Even if none of them were, and I would suggest most of them were not, the outcome is no different than if they all had been, or if a large number of them had been, because at the end of the day, if it's subconscious bias, it doesn't change the outcome. And I would suggest it probably is that. It's almost as if the employers, when they looked at those resumes, right, and they saw someone who they perceived as likely being black because of the name, it's as if they could no longer see what was on the page, right? It's as if their ability to objectively filter what they're looking at on a resume or an application, that somehow their faculties deserted them in that moment, right? Whereas if it was somebody with a white name, it's like, oh my goodness, look at all these qualifications. Someone with a black name, it's like, yeah, they're qualified, but I don't know about this, right? So all of a sudden, something is getting in the way of an objective evaluation, even if these folks are not overtly biased. That ought to give us pause. It ought to make us realize that there's a lot of internalized stuff that we walk around with that can easily affect how we actually look at others. And of course, the evidence says this is true in the classroom as well, with teachers and the way they view students. It's true with law enforcement and how they view folks who they encounter on the street and in the community, right? And knowing that isn't really about beating yourself up or feeling bad or feeling guilty. It's about saying that if that is true, employers, for instance, and law enforcement and teachers have got to build in certain policies and practices and procedures to safeguard against having those biases become discriminatory treatment, right? Something that can interrupt, sort of like a firewall on your computer, right? That can interrupt the thought before it becomes the deed, right? Because it's one thing to have the thought, it's another to act on the thought. If we can institute certain practices that allow our, let's say, HR managers or personnel committee folks who are looking to hire people, or admissions officers at a college or whatever it might be, if they're trained to understand the way that subconscious bias operates and sometimes skews our ability to view merit fairly, then the evidence actually says that once they're trained on doing that, they can do a much better job. That's sort of the good news from the implicit bias, subconscious bias research, is that once you're aware of it, most people do try really hard to get it right, and that extra effort often allows them to get it right, but we can't do that if we're not being honest about our lack of objectivity. So that's the first myth under which we operate. The second, and it's closely related to the first, is that even when we are capable, even if we were perfectly capable of objectively evaluating people, the second myth is the myth of institutional objectivity. That is not just personal bias and objectivity, but the idea that our institutions are fair and that the criteria we're using to evaluate people are fair. See, here's the problem. Even if we were perfectly capable of evaluating people fairly, if the criteria that we're using to do the evaluation are flawed, then the outcomes are going to be flawed, regardless of our best intentions and our own ability to evaluate using that criteria. What do I mean by that? Well, think about in the realm of education first, and then we'll think about employment. In the realm of education, what are the criteria we typically look at to determine who's most qualified to go to this university or that university? Who's most qualified to go to this medical school, this law school, this business school, or maybe this one over here instead? The criteria that we typically use throughout the Western world, right, are these standardized tests and evaluation mechanisms that we're told are highly objective, but which we know are highly correlated with what? Access and opportunity, right? We know that certain folks will, in fact, and things like the SAT and other standardized tests have long been correlated most with income, more correlated with your zip code, right, your postal code, where you actually grow up, than your actual ability or your hard work or your initiative or your effort. And so if we have these tests that clearly track opportunity, even if the tests were objective, and I do not happen to believe that they are, I believe that they're highly subjective, but even if they were perfect instruments for evaluating academic ability, if they measure, in addition to potential ability, class background and status and opportunity and exposure, what I've been exposed to, not what I'm capable of, right? Then by definition, the outcomes are going to skew in favor of some and against others, having very little to do with actual ability. Same is true with hiring criteria. If I ask any employer, how do you make your hiring decisions? Every employer has the same answer. Well, we hire the most qualified people, of course. We just want the most qualified people. Whoever the most qualified person is, that's who we're going to hire, of course. That's the rhetoric, and that's maybe even the goal. But now, is that the truth? Well, what's the criteria we use to determine who's qualified? Think about the most basic and seemingly objective of them. Experience. That seems fair. That seems objective. What could be more objective than that? That's not a test. That's just actually like what's on your resume. You've got 10 years and this person's got 7 years. You've got 6 and they've got 4. You've accomplished this, this, and this, and they've only accomplished this, this, and that seems objective. But experience and the credentials that come from experience. Credentials, different than qualifications, not the same. Credentials are these on-paper things that give us certain clues about what people have accumulated. It doesn't necessarily tell us how good they are. Right? I used to actually, during a period when I was perpetually unemployed in the mid-1990s, in between anti-racism work, I would do resumes for people, right? I could make a little money on the side by doing folks' resumes. I was good at making resumes now. Seriously, I could make you look like the best employee ever. Like I knew how to write them. I'd read books about how to write them, right? So that tells you right there that I can make you have all kinds of credentials just based on the way, because I'm a good writer. That's sort of what I do, right? So I can do that. You think other people don't learn how to do that? You think you can't Google how to make a resume look like of course people can do that. So credentials themselves don't tell us very little, because that's just about what I'm able to put on this piece of paper, right? Qualifications, actual ability, merit, initiative, hard work, effort, right? Those are things that you really can't put on a page too clearly. So qualifications, which seem to be fair, things like experience or seniority, those kinds of things, reflect the opportunity structure. In other words, if I've had more access than you, I'm supposed to look better on paper. Right? Bottom line. If I've had more access than you, my resume should be more impressive than yours. If I've had more access than you, I should have more experience than you. Right? It's like having an 8-lap relay race. If we have an 8-lap relay race and I've had a 5-lap head start, okay, heads up, I'm supposed to cross the finish line first. You got that, right? I'm supposed to win the race in that sense. And if I had a 5-lap head start and I didn't finish at least 5 laps ahead, there's something wrong with me, right? In fact, if I started 5 laps ahead and at the end of the race I'm only 3 laps ahead, who's the faster runner? Not me. But if all you're seeing is the end result, right? Because that's the way we operate as societies, don't we? We're sort of winner take all. We look at the end result. We're looking at who's hitting the tape in the race, metaphorically speaking. We're not looking at what happened those other 8 laps. We're not seeing what actually came before. So when it comes time for a hiring situation, we're just looking at the end result. We're looking at the tape that got crossed by the runners. And you crossed the tape first. Look, clearly you have more experience and more seniority and more this, that, and the other. Well, of course, a person who's had more access should. So if I'm going to make a truly objective decision, I can't just look at these outcome factors. I have to look holistically at what came before, not just for the sake of fairness now, but for the sake of my institution. Because if I'm just going to evaluate the end result and that doesn't tell me everything I need to know, I might be making decisions that aren't just unfair but are bad for my company, my organization, my agency. Because I'm missing all of these other factors of merit and ability that could actually be critical to the functioning of my institutional space. So even when the criteria seems fair, it might very well be so unobjective as to create skewed opportunity. Give you an example of what I mean. Several years ago, I was in Bermuda doing some work, and one of the companies that I was working with was it was a reinsurance company, which is a big thing in Bermuda. I'd never heard of reinsurance until I went to Bermuda. I guess that's the people that insure insurance companies. I don't know how many rounds of insurance you got to have to feel secure, but whatever. It's a very big business, and I'm glad that it's there. That's wonderful. So I was there, and I was doing this training with this very small, relative to some of them, insurance company, and they were pretty self-aware in a way that I think was really helpful, and they were very honest, and they said, we had this thing happen about 6 months ago, and we wanted to get your take on it. And they told me about this job search that they had been engaged in, where there was a black Bermudian and a white Bermudian who were applying for this particular job, and it was like an underwriter's position. And in order to, they were essentially equally qualified in terms of their experience and their education. So it was going to come down to this test, and it was like, as I recall, maybe a 20-question kind of test. And it was an essay test, so you had these 20 questions, you had to write like a paragraph or two, and it was sort of situations that you might find yourself in, and what would you do, kind of what would be the proper decision from an underwriter's perspective for this scenario, that scenario. And it was a timed exam, so hour and a half or whatever hour. At the end of the testing period, when the bell rang or whatever they did and told them to put their pencils or pens down or whatever, the white woman had finished all 20 of the questions, had answered them all, and the black woman had only answered, I think, 14. So there were 6 that she had not gotten to. But the black woman, out of the 14 that she answered, she only missed 1. So she got 13 out of 14 right. The white woman who'd finished the test and gotten all 20 had missed 5. So now they have sort of a dilemma, right? Because there are 2 criteria, both of them ostensibly objective, fair-minded, race-neutral criteria, upon which you could make this decision. One is efficiency and speed, which has its virtues. There's certainly value in that, getting the work done and getting it done on time. And if you make the decision on the basis of that criteria, the white woman clearly gets the job. But there's also this thing called accuracy, which I would think in the insurance business would probably be valuable. From the perspective of hiring an underwriter, you'd want them to get it right, not just get it done quickly. But I can see an argument being made for either of those. I can see a merit-based rationale being given for making either of those decisions, because they might think to themselves, well, you know, we can teach the accuracy to the fast one. It's harder to teach speed to the accurate one. I could see them arguing that. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I can imagine it. So they had a dilemma. They had 2 ostensibly objective criteria, but they were now in conflict. What do we do? Well, they shared with me that the decision they ultimately made was they hired the white woman on the basis of this idea that they could teach accuracy, right, on the job, but the speed and the efficiency was something that was just sort of natural. You either had it or you didn't, right? And they fell prey to that belief, which, you know, I don't know, maybe that's an argument. And at the end of the day, they were self-aware enough to realize that they'd made a horrible mistake, because this happened 6 months ago, and this woman had already flamed out and lost her job because she wasn't actually very good at it. So they were starting to rethink, but their whole point was that they were aware, in a sense, that they had made a decision on the basis of an ostensibly objective criteria, but a criteria that really wasn't objective, because one of the things that explains why, and I told them this, I said, you know, there's some research that might explain why the black woman who was applying for that job took longer to finish, having nothing to do with her inability to be quick. I said, you know, there's all this research on this concept known as stereotype threat or stereotype vulnerability. I don't know if you're familiar with the term. A lot of educators are, a lot of other folks are not. This research was originally begun in the classroom setting, basically to try to understand why it was that even when marginalized group members were very good and very qualified and very motivated to do well, let's say in school, and later it's been looked at in the job market as well, why it was that they often underperformed relative to dominant group members, even when they were just as qualified. And what the research found was that in many ways, the thing that explains that is that when you're a member of a marginalized group, you're so concerned about getting it right. You're so concerned about defeating the negative stereotype that it actually generates anxiety when you're taking a test, for instance, right? And so a couple of things can happen. Either you get so anxious that you get distracted and you underperform, or you're so worried about confirming a negative stereotype that you take a really long time to make sure that you crossed all the T's and you dotted all the I's and you triple check your work, and then the buzzer rings and you're out of time, right? And so I said, you know, based on that, and this is really fascinating research. You should Google this concept, stereotype threat. There's actually a whole website called Undoing, I believe it's called Undoing Stereotype Threat. There's a book called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele, who's the expert on this. Basically what they did was they would take people who were equally qualified, put them in different rooms, give them the same test. Some of them were black, some of them were white. Then they did it with people who had money and people who didn't have money, did it with men and women on math exams. And what they would do is they would say to one group, this is a test of ability. It's going to tell us how prepared you are. It's going to, in other words, it counts. Like when you take a real test, you think it counts. It means something. The other group, they basically gave the very same test, but they said, this doesn't mean anything. Don't worry about it. We're not even going to grade it. Just take it, you know. And when the pressure was off, there was no difference between white test takers and black test takers, or men and women on a math exam, or more affluent people and working class people, or they actually did it with white and Asian folks on math, which was an interesting thing, right? Because now, which of those groups feel stereotyped regarding math negatively? It's not the Asian, like, you know, Asian folks know they're not all good at math, right? But apparently people who are not Asian think that's like scientific fact, that they're all just, you know, math and science geniuses. Now the Asian folks are laughing, thinking, well, I'm not really very good at math, but I know those white folks are flipping out because, you know, and so sure enough, the white folks get in the room, you tell them it's a test of math ability, the white folks underperform. You put them in a room, tell them it's not a test of ability, it doesn't mean anything, there's no difference. They've done it with athletics. You can take white guys and black guys, and it's not what you think. Like, you might think the example they used was basketball. No. It's not one where the stereotypes are prevalent. It's miniature golf, right? They literally took white guys and black guys and had them play miniature golf. And they told in one group, they told them, this is a test of natural athletic ability. What? Have you ever played miniature golf? Like, is there anyone who actually thinks there's natural athleticism involved in this game? It's really just hand-eye coordination and, maybe some geometry, but that's about it. And the other group, they said it's a test of strategic sports intelligence. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds great, right? Sounds like a big deal. Now, what do you think happens when they tell them it's natural athletic ability? The white guys flip out, right? They're oh my God, I'm playing miniature golf against a black guy who probably has an extra femur and more fast twitch muscle fibers and is naturally faster. Like that matters on a miniature golf course. But, right, they've internalized those stereotypes, so now they're the ones who underperform. You put them on the same course, tell them it's strategic sports intelligence, and the white guys win and the black guys underperform because it's triggering a stereotype about intelligence and this fear that, oh my God, if I don't do well, they're going to think it's because I'm black, right? Just like the women in the math exam. If I don't do well, some of these guys are going to think it's because I'm a girl or because I'm a woman, right? So in other words, that can happen not only in the classroom. Now we know from the research it happens in interview settings on the job, right? So if I'm being interviewed, right, and I'm worried about triggering a stereotype, right? Because all I got to do is just anything, right, that triggers a stereotype about gender, about class, about religion, about race. And that's the thing, according to the research, that sticks in the mind of the evaluator, right? So if a woman in an interview seems really, like, you notice I speak with my hands, this is what I do, right? But if I do this, and I do this all the time, like I do this, we're having dinner, I'd be doing this. Like it wouldn't be quite as big because that would freak you out, and I'd knock things over. But in general, I speak with my hands all the time. But I can do this because as a white male, this is not seen as threatening or in any way off-putting. The research says that if a woman does this, it has a very different reaction. It's seen as over-emotional. Then it triggers stereotypes about emotionalism, right? Which are not going to attach to me as a man. It's interesting. We have these stereotypes about women as emotional when men start like all the wars. And those are usually not based on logic and rationality. It's usually based on heavy emotion, but we're the ones who engage in the bar fights, which is also usually fueled by emotion, not logic, but women are the over-emotional ones. Okay, got that, right? So in other words, when women are being interviewed, they're having to actually think about the way that they speak, the tone of voice, the amplitude with which they speak. A person of color in an interview setting, wondering about things like, okay, first of all, let's say if I speak with an accent that is not the accent of the country, right? Maybe I'm a recent immigrant. Or maybe a not so recent immigrant, but I still speak accented whatever the dominant language is. I'm worried about the pronunciation. I'm overthinking that, right? Or I'm worried about mispronouncing a word because God forbid if I mispronounce a word, it might trigger a stereotype about my ability. Whereas a white guy, look, it's easy. I'm from the United States. We had a president not too long ago, right, who mispronounced words regularly, like with a regularity unprecedented in the history of the English language. You would just make up words that didn't exist, right? And we sort of laughed about it. Even he laughed about it. He had a good sense of humor about it. That was one thing I always liked about him. He's very self-deprecating, and he would laugh about the fact that he was completely incapable of speaking more than a paragraph at a time without mispronouncing something. And we all sort of blew it off and said, well, it's just he's from Texas, and that's why, right? But as a white guy, I never had to worry about, like when I would see him do that, no other white people were like, oh my God, if he keeps doing this, he's going to screw it up for all of us. We're never going to get hired for anything again. But when President Obama was running for office, make no mistake, I have no doubt that not only did he know that he had to pronounce words correctly and never end a sentence with a preposition, right? Never do anything that might trigger that stereotype, but he had to be more articulate, more erudite, more sort of perfect in his diction and everything else than any white person would ever have had to be in that campaign, ever had to have been before as president. And every person of color watching that election in the United States and maybe around the world was sitting there just waiting and knowing that if he mispronounced anything, it would have been, oh my God, what have you done? You got to hold it down for us, because it's a very different reality. So that's the thing. You can be very objective and fair-minded. You can be using criteria that you think is objective and fair-minded, but at the end of the day, certain people are operating under the threat of triggering a negative stereotype, knowing what that means. And that could explain why that woman in Bermuda took longer on the test, not because she's less qualified, but because she is more qualified and recognizes the biases of the people who will be doing the evaluating. So she was actually highly actualized, if you will, and self-aware. Unfortunately, the company was not as self-aware at that time, but they became more so. That just gives us an idea of how these supposedly objective criteria can lead us astray. One last thing, and then I'll take some questions. This is the third myth, and it's ultimately the myth of fairness. Not just objectivity, but the myth of fairness. We really like to believe that at the end of the day, our institutions, whether they are companies or agencies, whether they are universities, colleges, whatever they are, we like to believe that our institutions fundamentally do revert to some type of fair mean, that we sometimes get it wrong, yes, but for the most part we get it right, and we're certainly trying to do our best. And yet there's an awful lot of evidence that the whole notion that the way people get jobs, the way people move up in private sector, or for that matter in state agencies, really has very little to do with that. And there's a study that was released last year, talked about in the New York Times about a year ago, that actually demonstrated that very conclusively. It was looking at the job market in the US, but I doubt very seriously that it's all that different in Canada. The numbers might be a little different, but my guess is the overall basic underlying truth about which this study and this article was speaking probably is similar here. What they found was that almost half of the new jobs in the economy in the last several years are being filled by one particular mechanism. And it has nothing to do with an objective and fair competition. So it's not even about, are we objective or are our criteria objective? There's no actual normal evaluation happening for about half the jobs. Half the jobs are being filled by way of letters of recommendation written by pre-existing employees at a certain company. So that's not even just the old-fashioned old boys network. We've always known there were old boys networks that operated, of course. This is actually beyond that. The old boys network is about like, oh, do you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who can put in a good word? No, we're way beyond that. We're asking, do you know Jim over in the HR department? That's what we're wanting to know now. And if you don't know Jim in HR, or you don't know Mary over in accounting, or you don't know somebody who's already there, basically half the jobs are scratched for you from the very beginning, regardless of how good you are, because what companies are doing is increasingly relying on these internal references. Now, if you ask a company why they do this, right, they're going to give you an answer, and it's certainly going to have nothing to do with racism or sexism or classism or any of that. It's going to be an answer that actually, again, if you hooked them up to a lie detector and asked them and they gave you this answer, it would register as the truth because they think this is what is important. They would tell you, and they did in this article. They said, well, the reason we do it is, it's easier and it's cheaper. It cuts down job search cost. And I'm sure it does, right? If you're going to, because you got to think about it, right? You got to figure, okay, the guy that Jim recommends may not be the very best, but he's probably going to be okay because Jim's okay. So if Jim works for us and he's working out all right, he's not probably going to recommend a total schmuck. Like he's not going to, he's not going to recommend a total idiot who's going to bring us down. So, we can probably hedge our bet and take Jim's recommendation and it'll probably work out. So it makes the job search a lot easier, it makes it quicker, you get the job filled, and the odds are pretty good that person will be okay if the person that wrote the letter of recommendation is working out, right? The problem being, what do you think the implications are for fairness and for equity? Well, the study said, and the article talked about it, that the overwhelming majority of folks who benefit from this type of internal reference networking for new jobs are going to be white, and they're going to be male, they're going to be affluent, and they're going to have gone to the quote-unquote right colleges, right? So they're going to have all these class factors, race factors, gender factors working in their favor. And as a result, you could be the most qualified person, or someone could be the most qualified person for that job. They could be a person of color, a woman of any color, a working class white guy for that matter, or just someone who didn't go to the most elite college or university, and they'll never even be known about. So now we've moved beyond the 8-lap race where somebody's got a 5-lap head start. That was the metaphor I used before. Screw that. Now we're talking about people who don't even know there's a racetrack, right? Like, because if you don't know Jim in accounting, you don't even know there's a race. Race? What are you talking about? And the people who are setting up the race, they don't know about you. You might be the fastest runner, but they never heard of you. And you never heard of them. And you don't know the people that you need to know. So now what we're talking about is a structure, a system, an institutional reality by which and under which and through which unequal opportunity is perpetuated over and over again, irrespective of the intentionality of the people in that group or the criteria that they might otherwise use, because they're not even using a criteria. They're just relying on those internal references. And this is probably one of the reasons in my country, and I would imagine the data, again, quite similar in Canada. In the United States, one of the things that we always struggle with is how to interpret our data, right? So we can look at data, for instance, that says that African Americans are 85%, almost twice as likely as whites when they both have a college degree. Black folks with a degree almost twice as likely as whites with a college degree to be out of work. Latino folk with a degree, 50 to 60% more likely than similar whites with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans, about 28%, almost a third more likely to be out of work when they have a degree than white folks with a degree. Indigenous First Nations peoples, about 60% more likely to be out of work with a degree than whites with a degree. And on the one hand, it's hard to interpret that. Like, people don't want to believe that it's racism, and I don't believe that it's necessarily overt and conscious racism, but I do think that it's quite possible that's about that networking thing. Because there I am, I'm a person of color, I've got the degree, I've done everything right. Yeah, but you didn't go to the right college, or you didn't meet the right people, or you didn't belong to the right organizations or clubs or fraternities or whatever it was, and as a result, we don't know about you. Maybe if we did know about you, we really would try to bring you in, whether we did it under the name of diversity or we did it under the name of equity and fairness. But if we don't even know about you, our good intentions really can't help you now, right? Because our good intentions don't allow us to see the universe of potential applicants. So what we've got to do, bottom line, in our institutional space, particularly when it comes to hiring, when it comes to the world of work, is we've got to think capaciously about how to create policies and practices and procedures that do really a couple of things and do them very intentionally. One is they've got to interrogate unconscious and subconscious bias at the personal level. And the good news is that's not that hard to do. There is some evidence that if we have search committees, for instance, or other evaluative bodies, just read even a one-page description of how subconscious bias operates and how sometimes we fall into those traps despite our best intentions. There's some evidence that simply a brief, it could be a one-page reminder about that, actually goes a long way toward helping people evaluate more fairly. They did a study a couple years ago with mock juries where they had these juries watch a trial, right? And the juries were white, and the criminal defendant in the case, the presumed criminal, and the defendant in the case was black. And the evidence was sort of weak, but, could result in a conviction or an acquittal. And one of the white juries, when they went back to evaluate, was told by the judge about unconscious bias. And all the judge said was something along the lines of, hey, listen, this sometimes happens. People don't mean for it to happen, but just be aware that sometimes, when we evaluate people who are racially or ethnically different than ourselves, we sometimes view them through the lens of this stereotype. That's what the research says, so just be really careful that you're not doing that. The other group saw the same case, went back, they weren't told that. They were just told about the law and how to apply the law. What do you think happened? Well, the group that was told about unconscious bias, yeah, they acquitted a little more often, but that wasn't really the dramatic finding. What was interesting was they took longer to think, right? They actually sat there and evaluated the evidence more carefully. They had better discussion. They had better argument, right? They actually seemed to be crossing the T's and dotting the I's. Why? Well, according to the researchers, it was because they wanted to get it right. You've put them on notice that they might screw it up, and because most people are good people who don't want to hurt other people, they were like, damn, we really got to be careful. We don't want to do this unconscious bias thing, right? But these other people didn't know about the unconscious bias thing. They're like, screw it, guilty, innocent, I don't know, let's go have lunch, right? So basically what it suggests is when we put people on notice, because most people aren't sociopaths, most people are good people, they don't want to hurt folks, when you put them on notice of how easy it is to make a mistake, they actually try harder. So we can begin to do that. We could actually build in practices and procedures. The second thing is we've got to have the same type of intentionality around reevaluating and constantly reassessing our standards, right? For hiring. I'll go and ask companies sometimes, I'll look at their last job posting and it'll say, 6 to 8 years, 4 to 6 years, 2 to 3 years, 5 to 7 years required or desired. And I'll ask them, why 5 to 7 years? Why 4 to 6? Why 2 to 3? Why not 3 years, 1 month, a week, and an hour, all the way up to 11 years and a month? Like, why did you pick those numbers? Is there some study that you've done that actually demonstrated that anything below this will render you completely unqualified for the position? And they've never done such a study. They've never done an actual analysis to determine the fairness of their criteria. You know what it usually is, they tell me? They say, well, that's what the last guy had to have. Oh. Or that's what I had to have, so by God, they need to have. Oh, I get it now, right? So it's what's called the positional good. It's something I've got that you want, and by God, I'm going to make you jump through the same hoops that I had to jump through, never actually asking whether those hoops made any sense whatsoever. So we actually have to have some evaluation of the criteria. Why are we saying that we expect to see this and this? And when we expect to see this and this, is that really about ability? Is that really about initiative and all the things that matter in perseverance, the things that matter in the workforce and actually lead to people being successful or not so successful? Or is it about a criteria that really just reflects the opportunity structure? And then we've got to really interrogate the way that we often rely on networks and informal recommendations and even formal recommendations to fill positions, because so oftentimes that leads to unfair and unequal outcomes. Now, if we're going to do that, it doesn't mean that we have to get rid of that. We always know there are going to be people that pass along information about job openings to other people. We're going to do that. We're going to tell our friends, we're going to tell family, we're going to tell neighbors. But if we're going to do that, we need to make a conscious decision that when we are talking about what those opportunities are, that we're making sure that those same things are said to people who maybe are not in our immediate circle, because unfortunately we're often so isolated from one another racially, ethnically, religiously, and culturally that if we only tell the people that we really interact with on a regular basis, it's going to be a very closed network. And for the benefit of the very places where we work, we need to do better. Because if we're relying on those internal networks, I mean, the only way that that really helps an organization is if you fundamentally accept the premise that Jim in accounting actually does know the next most qualified person for a job in that company. What are the odds of that mathematically? What are the odds that Jim just so happens to play golf or whatever it is with the very next best person for a job? Like, that's incredibly unlikely in a country with hundreds of millions of people, in a world of billions of people. What are the odds that the two best guys for these jobs just so happen to live down the street from one another? Very, very unlikely. So for the sake of the organization, for the sake of a company, for the sake of an agency or an institution, we need to be casting the net far more broadly. This isn't just about equity and fairness, though it is about that. It's also about the institutional integrity of our companies, of our agencies, of our organizations. If we do those things, then I think we can move well beyond diversity, this sort of buzzword that again can mean everything and nothing all at once, and move into this realm that we call equity, which is really where we obviously need to be. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. I appreciate your time. Take a few questions and then let you out to do some of the workshops, which I know are going to be great. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Questions, and then we'll break to go into our groups.
Great.
I'm just wondering if you could tell us where we can find that study, like the study that you...
The one about the finance jobs and the accounting jobs, or that one? Okay. So the more recent one about the black names and the white names with the accounting jobs was released in late December. I have the PDF file. I'll be happy to send it to you. I don't remember the website off the top of my head. There was a economist at University of Pennsylvania, one at Auburn, and one at maybe Western Michigan. But I will, if anyone interested, email me at timjwise, just the letter J, wise, at mac.com, mac.com, and I'll be happy to send you the PDF of that. The older study is, the older black name, white name study has been out for quite a while, and I can also send you that link, the one from 2003. The New York Times piece about networking, if you're interested in that, I can also send you that link. It was February of 2013 or March of 2013 article, and it references a study that had come out around that time. So anyone who's interested in those, I can send you those. I can also send you the link to this to the book about stereotype threats. So I'll be happy to hook you up with all of those things if you write to me. Yeah. What's that?
Your books as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, sure. I'll push my own merchandise as well. Sure, absolutely. Next question, please. Yeah.
Sorry, I was here last night, and you quoted a book about the origins of racism in Europe and the different theory, and I just would really like, you said it kind of fast, and I was wondering.
Yeah. Now, the book I mentioned last night is called Yurugu, Yurugu, and it's a Swahili word, which is why for most of you it will seem like you've never heard it. And the subtitle is sort of long. It's an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior, and the author is Marimba, M-A-R-I-M-B-A, Ani, A-N-I, and she's a scholar and a longtime civil rights activist, actually from the 60s, at which time her name was Donna Richards. She was in SNCC and has since become a fantastic Afrocentric scholar and just brilliant theorist. And the book basically, and like I said last night, I don't agree with everything in the book, which is true, I think, of any book that most of us read, but it's really a very in-depth analysis of the way that white supremacy, and for that matter, the class system and patriarchy, and a lot of the systems that skew equal opportunity sort of come out of the same common seedbed of sort of cosmology or worldview, right? And it's the cosmology that developed in Europe coming out of Greek philosophy, where the Greeks, who of course were not really European, but have provided a lot of what became the seedbed of European culture, Mediterranean peoples who white folks appropriated for our own purposes. Again, that's another interesting lecture for another time. But Greek philosophy sort of develops these dichotomies of good versus bad, good and evil, male and female, strong and weak, nature versus nurture, reason versus emotion. This is all very central to Greek thought, and what Marimba Ani talks about is how that concept, which is a break with non-European cultures that had, whether it was Asian cultures, this notion of yin and yang, or this notion of complementarity and twinness in African cultures where everything sort of operated in a circular, it wasn't linear, it was more circular, it was more, that there was a give and take, it wasn't just a hard and fast line. And the Greeks really changed that, and as a result, European thought sort of moved along this trajectory of dichotomies where everything was, either this or that. And she explains how that led to racist thinking, how it led to sexist thinking, how it led to exploitation of resources. It's really a fascinating, it's a very dense book, very thick, very, very philosophical. It took, I think I read it over about a 2-month period because I had to start and stop. It's not the easiest read because it's very heavy with deep philosophical premises, but I think it's worth looking at for sure. And third question, I'll let you choose since I don't want to mess one person over for the sake of another if someone has one. Literally, there you go.
You mentioned the stereotype vulnerability, and
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that concept. So I'm wondering, how do we make sure in our organizations that we're not doing that at the application level
Yeah.
and beyond?
Well, one of the things that the research and Claude Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi, goes into detail a little bit about how to avoid stereotype threat. Most of his book does talk about it in the academic setting, but some of the principles are applicable. I think that, what they found is that to undo stereotype threat, you have to do a couple of things. At the point of application, I guess it's really about making sure that someone who's being interviewed for a position, someone who's being evaluated where it could kick in, one of the things that would put a person at ease, I gather, from the research and also from just thinking through the concept, would be that, rather than sitting down and having a conversation where it's about, well, tell me about your experience, right? Where it's really very focused on the task, and it's very focused on what I've accomplished, and it's very focused on these, these qualifications that I'm worried you're gonna see through or not value. It's really more about making sure that when we're doing evaluations, and I think this is good for no matter who we're evaluating, but especially if it's someone from an otherwise marginalized group, is to start off by just tell me about you, right? I just need to know about you. I just need to know a little bit about you, a little bit about your background, not even your work background, just tell me about you. Tell me what you're interested in. Tell me something that you enjoy doing, right? Because, and they seem trite and unrelated to the job, but here's why it's important. So in the academic research that Steele talks about, one of the things they found that reduces stereotype threat in the classroom, and this is why I'm saying I think it would work pretty well in this setting as well, is that there was an experiment they went into, I believe it was junior high school, it might have been 9th grade, but sort of that middle school to high school level, and they took these students and they, in one class, they did an experiment where for the first semester of school, first 3 or 4 months, they, every couple of weeks, they would do this thing where right before a test or before some quiz, the teacher would say, take out a piece of paper and just write down, take 5 minutes, we're not gonna grade this, we're not gonna pick it up, this is really just a centering exercise, just a way to sort of get focused and centered for the morning. Take out a piece of paper and a pen and just write something down about something that matters to you, something that's important to you, some value that's important to you. They didn't specify that's valuable to you as a black person or an Asian person or anything. It wasn't that. It was just generally for you. Tell me something that's important to you. And what they found was that the classroom that had this intervention, and it was contrasted with another classroom down the hall, same kind of students, same kind of class, but they weren't given this intervention, this centering exercise. The one group did it 4 times a semester. The other group didn't do it at all. What they found was that in the group where it was done, the marginalized students of color increased their grade point average by 3/4 of a full letter grade and did considerably better. And that impact, that raising it almost by a full letter grade lasted for 2 years after the experiment was done, at which point they just stopped evaluating it. But 2 years out, it was still having that effect. And the other folks, there was no rise at all. What they surmised from this and concluded from this was that once you've asked a person who otherwise might be under stereotype threat, might be worried about confirming a negative about themselves, when you've asked them to essentially tell you something positive about themselves, and not even tell you because they told them we're not even going to collect it, but it was just a matter of that person being able to go to that place in their mind where they're writing down something or they're expressing something that's an affirmation of who they are, and that alone puts them in a certain space so that when they take that test or they take that quiz, they end up doing better. And I think you can imagine how asking a person at the outset of an evaluation or at the outset of an interview, hey, tell me something about yourself. What do you like to do? What are your hobbies? What are things that you care about? Tell me about your family, whatever. Those are the kind of things that can put a person in a very different, more relaxed space where they're not as likely to think that you're trying to see through them, right? And you're trying to pick out every little weakness, but you're actually trying to get to know them and create some type of a bond. And that's one way I think at the entry level of a job we could do it. Beyond that, it's very important that we have criteria for evaluating that are broad-based. One of the problems is that if there are only a handful of criteria upon which people are judged, it intensifies stereotype threat. So if there's just one test, or if there's just one job-related goal, or if there's one particular deadline that people either meet or they don't meet, and then that's the only criteria, then that really intensifies the stereotype threat. If we build in multiple criteria where people might be weak on this one, but they're good on this one, then they can feel a lot less worried about confirming a negative stereotype. And the final thing is constructing our workspaces and our classrooms to be as unindividualistic as possible and as collaborative as possible. And the reason this is important is that if you're operating under stereotype threat and you're also working in isolation, right? So whether it's in the classroom and I'm studying by myself, right? Or it's on the job and I'm working in my little cubicle and I'm just working by myself and I've got my work to do and I've got my deadline to meet and I'm not really part of a team and most of my work I do alone. That really intensifies the stereotype threat because everything's on my shoulders. If I drop the ball, everybody's going to know I dropped the ball. Whereas if I'm working in a team, it's not clear where the lines of communication may have broken down. And so if my team doesn't do as well, no one person has to take the fall. And if we work together, I'm not as stressed because I know I don't have to know everything. So there was one study at Berkeley many years ago. There was a calculus professor there who noticed that his black students were underperforming in the calculus lab relative to Asian and white students. And he knew they were good students. He asked them, they'd all taken calculus in high school, so it wasn't like they'd never seen this material, but they weren't doing very well. And so what he did, he said, can I observe you the way that you study for tests and things? Do you mind if I just sort of hang out, come to your dorm, watch you in the cafeteria and take notes? I just want to see how people study. And he didn't tell them what he was looking for. He just asked, and they said, sure. So what he did is he'd drop in on them in their room when they were studying, and there they'd be, and he'd look at them on the quad outside the buildings or in the cafeteria or in the residence halls, and he'd notice the difference. And what he noticed was that the Asian students and the white students almost always studied in teams of 3 or 4 or 5 people. They would be studying together. The black students studied just as long. They spent just as much time preparing, but they almost always studied by themselves. And what he concluded from that was that if you're studying by yourself, and this is before Steele even brought up the term stereotype vulnerability, that term didn't even exist yet. This is in the early 80s when Treisman was doing this at Berkeley. He concluded sort of, implicitly that what's going on is these folks are taking on all this pressure, and for whatever reason, it's screwing them up. Now, Steele's analysis would be it's screwing them up because they're feeling the pressure. They know that if they don't do well, it's all on them, whereas the group that's studying together, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. I bring one piece, you bring one piece, you bring one piece, and eventually we're all going to get it, And so what he did is he went back to his classroom the next time they had lab, and he said, look, there's a new rule for us in the classroom. Everybody has to study in teams. Right? You all have to make teams. And it wasn't like that year that Survivor did like the racial teams. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like there's the Asian team and the black team and the white team. They didn't split them up that way. They made sure they were mixed. But the idea was we want everybody to have study partners. And just by making that one move, that one classroom change, that's all he did, at the end of the semester and for every year afterward, he's always done this, the grades, the differences are now essentially statistically insignificant between black students and white students and Asian students. And some years, the black students actually do better than the white and the Asian students. And the only change that he made was how they study. And that's because working together reduces that fear of confirming something negative. So I would say that would be another clue. But if people are interested in that, you can either look up that book on your own, or if you email me, I'll be happy to send you the link to it on Amazon or wherever you might be interested in purchasing it. It's a great, fantastic book, and like I said, there's a website associated with it as well, so I'll be happy to send you those links. Anyway, thank you all so very much for being here. I appreciate your time. Thank you.